everybody, and welcome to this new video on my channel. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm actually going to be just rambling on about a few different topics that really interest me, and also topics that I've thought about maybe at some point doing a video on. Now, there's not really going to be any video, so to speak. It's just going to be me talking, and I feel like you could just put this on in the background, maybe while you're doing something else or playing a game. But yeah, I hope you enjoy, and let's get into it. So, the first topic we're going to be talking about is board games. Now, I really enjoy the experience of playing board games. I think it's fun for a variety of reasons, both because it's a nice social activity with your friends or with your family, but also because it is something that at least at sometimes can be highly strategic, although it's obviously really dependent on what board game you play. So some of the mainstream board games aren't particularly interesting in my opinion. Games like Monopoly or maybe Trivial Pursuit, they can be fun because they're targeted at a very wide audience, so basically anyone can play those games. But from a strategic perspective, they aren't really the most interesting. But I do want to assure you, it doesn't actually have to be that way. There are a lot of board games that are much more interesting than that, even if they don't get sort of a mainstream attention or if it's not something you can maybe pick up in a regular store, but they are out there and they do have a lot to offer. So, what you can see now on the screen is Cosmic Encounter and Escape from the Aliens in Outer Space, which are sort of two of my most favorite games in this more sort of niche strategic kind of genre. And I mean, I guess what kind of binds them together and what also I would say binds a lot of the stuff together in this video is the theme of sci-fi. I really obviously enjoy sci-fi. You've also seen that with Master of Orion that I've uploaded let's play videos of that. That's obviously also a sci-fi game. I just find that whole setting to be so interesting. But I'll just briefly be going through the two different games and giving you sort of a very general feel for what they're about. So, Cosmic Encounter is this game from 3 to 8 players, I think it is. And what you do is you take control of an alien race, and so do the other people in the game. And then you try to become the first person to colonize 5 planets outside of your own solar system. And you do this through using cards and using these small plastic ships. And it's pretty intuitive once you get into it. It's not a very complicated game, but it does have a really nice feel to it. Especially like the fact that you do get to control these alien races, and each alien race has its own special abilities. And the abilities are really interesting in the sense that oftentimes they kind of bend the rules of the game, or maybe even sometimes break the rules. I also think at least the Fantasy Flight version of Cosmic Encounter, which is the one you can see on the screen, and it is also the newest one by far, I think that version is also just aesthetically really cool to look at. I love the alien designs. I love all the pieces. Everything really looks good. Then the next one is Escape from the Aliens in Outer Space, and this is even more niche of a game, I guess. I mean, Cosmic Encounter is also niche, but it is kind of well known, at least amongst a certain type of nerd population, I guess. But Escape from the Aliens in Outer Space is kind of different in the sense that it's even more niche, honestly. Now the game is kind of like Scotland Yard if you've played that game, and Scotland Yard is about being this detective who's looking for criminals, and some people in the game play the detective role, whereas others are the criminals, and the detective job is to find out where the criminals are located through a variety of clues. And it's a really interesting, I guess, deduction game you could say, or like a really game where you have to think and use logic, and I really do enjoy that. And also the whole mystery of not really knowing where the other people are, that's also really fun. Now, the game is pretty much like Scotland Yard, except the fact that it has a lot of cool mechanics and it's obviously themed in the whole sci fi universe, right? So it's taking place on a spaceship. The map is laid out like a spaceship, and stuff like that really does give it, at least to me, a lot more excitement than a game like Scotland Yard would have. But I do think these two games kind of showcase examples of what you can really do with board games and what board games are capable of. And maybe in the future, I want to do something on it. I'm not sure, but I think it's at least an interesting topic, so that's why I included it in this video. Next up, we have Star Wars, which is a really interesting topic, honestly. Again, because of the sci fi theme that really captivates me, and also just because we're talking about some really great movies that millions upon millions of people around the world have seen and loved. Now, I mean, obviously, when we talk about Star Wars, it is such a broad thing. There are video games, there are movies, there are TV shows, comic books, everything in between, right? But what we're talking about here for me is primarily the movies, and more specifically, the Skywalker saga. So, episode 1 through 9. And really, we can divide that even further and talk about the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and the sequel trilogy. And the original trilogy, those were the movies that came out back in the late 70s, early 80s. And those are the first movies that ever were released with Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and all those other characters. And those movies are obviously hugely influential throughout time. I mean, they have gotten such a cult status at this point, and I think that is to a large extent deservedly so, because they are great movies, and especially for the time, the special effects were really outstanding. And today, even they do kind of look pretty good, honestly. Then we have the prequel trilogy, which is kind of berated to a certain extent. It's not one that a lot of people are fans of, and I can understand why, because I think when you're watching those movies, they're just super complicated. The delivery isn't very good, the script isn't very good. There's just a whole bunch of stuff wrong with those movies. But what I will say is that I think they do deserve a bit more credit than what they usually get, because I do actually think the overall plot of those movies could be good if the movies had just been a bit different. So, for instance, the whole idea of the prequel trilogy, or at least one of the main sort of through lines, is the idea of Palpatine, the Emperor, subverting democracy and turning it into a dictatorship, and him becoming the leader of that dictatorship. And obviously, as a person who's interested, who's studied politics, I think that is a really cool idea. It's not something we oftentimes see, especially in these type of more sci-fi movies, because it is a bit more complicated. But I think it still resonates to the extent that you could have made a movie or a trilogy about that concept if the delivery and if the whole setup of the movies had been better. But despite that, I do think the prequels deserve some credit for introducing that theme into the mix. And there are also a lot of other cool stuff about the prequels. I love, for instance, General Grievous. I think his character design is really cool, even if he is kind of a one-dimensional character. But moving on then to the sequel trilogy, which, I mean, I guess if you're watching the video, you can see that's the thing I'm mainly focusing on, or mainly interested in, potentially discussing, is because I think those movies are interesting in a lot of ways. They are kind of looked down upon at this point as a missed opportunity, I would say. A lot of people think Disney could have done more with this trilogy, because ultimately these three movies are kind of a rehash of the original trilogy. Many of the story beats are repeated, and that is honestly pretty dull. I do agree with that. But at the same time, I kind of find myself enjoying these movies the most out of the different movies in these trilogies. I think these three movies do have a certain entertainment quality to them that are pretty noteworthy. So if you ask me what Star Wars movies would I like to just sit down and watch just for fun, I do think I would actually choose the sequel trilogy. Um, and I can't really put my finger on it necessarily. They're just really engaging, really interesting, and also really interesting to look at. I especially like Star Wars Episode 9. I don't know, the whole Exegol planet, everything with regard to that. I thought that looked extremely interesting, and I loved the set design, and I also loved the fact that the Emperor was back. I mean, he's pretty much the most interesting character throughout all the Star Wars movies, honestly. So yeah, I'm a bit torn on what to ultimately think about the sequel trilogy, but I do think it has some merit. I do think it is certainly fun to watch, and that is a pretty important criterion when I'm choosing what I want to see on a random Saturday night. Next up is Yu-Gi-Oh, which is a game I've played a bunch of times throughout my life, especially in my childhood. I remember playing this game on the playground, trading cards, and really having a blast with it, even if I didn't fully get the rules. And even later on in my life, I started taking it a bit more seriously. I looked at deck profiles online. I tried to, you know, get my skills honed, and I really tried also to understand the rules of the game. But I would say recently, certainly within the last few years at least, I have kind of fallen out of favor with the game. And that is for a lot of reasons. Maybe I just got bored of it, but I also do think there were changes to the game itself that didn't quite suit me. The game has always been very expensive. If you want to have a deck, you have to really spend a lot of money. But I also think the speed of the game has increased rapidly over time. There's been an introduction of a lot of different game mechanics, and that has really put me off, I feel. But I do really still enjoy that old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Obviously, when I was a kid, I also watched the anime, particularly the original anime with Yugi and Joey and all those other characters. And that gameplay, that old gameplay, I still really am fond of. And that isn't necessarily really possible to play today online or in physical formats necessarily, but there are still ways that I've been able to do it. Particularly, I've played some of the old Yu-Gi-Oh video games. I've played both the Yu-Gi-Oh game that was made for PC, Power of Chaos, and I also played the Yu-Gi-Oh game for the Nintendo DS called Yu-Gi-Oh Nightmare Troubadour. Especially Nightmare Troubadour, I've enjoyed quite a bit. I think it's a really fun game. You open packs in the game, but it's not something you pay for with real money, obviously. It's something that you earn through in game credits, and then you get a bunch of different cards, and then you can assemble a deck. And all the cards are old school, classic. The rules are as they were back in, I think, 2004 or so, when the game was actually released, or it might have been 2005 or 2006. But it's a really old game, and the rules are still as they were back then. So it's a much slower game, much more chill. And another thing I also really enjoy is the fact that the game has these god cards, which, at least in my childhood, were kind of the big thing in Yu Gi Oh! So the idea in the original anime was that you had these three god cards were kind of like all powerful. They were the best cards in the game. And if you were able to summon a god card, you basically won the duel automatically. Now, those cards weren't actually legal in the game for a very long time, and they weren't really available as much. I ended up getting them myself physically back in 2010 with the Legendary Collection. But they are actually also cards that you can obtain in the Nightmare Troubadour video game, and I really enjoy playing with them there because that's really been the only way in which I've been able to use those cards. So yeah, overall, just a really enjoyable old school hobby that I've kind of put on the back burner, but still have a lot of admiration, a lot of fondness for. Next interesting topic that I've thought about, and I know we're going kind of all over in this video, but I hope you do enjoy it nonetheless, is Transformers, and particularly the Transformers original trilogy, as I call it, the original three Michael Bay movies that were released in 2007, 9, and 2011. Now, more broadly, I do actually really enjoy Transformers, and I watched the G1 TV series back in the day when I was really young. I mean, I wasn't born. I don't think when I can't actually remember exactly when it came out, but I mean, I wasn't born back then. But I did watch it on VHS later on, and I really did enjoy that quite a bit. But the more recent memories I have of the Transformers universe are those three original Michael Bay movies. And I really did enjoy those a lot, even though they're completely dumb. I mean, we talked about Star Wars earlier, and those movies are like, I mean, the Star Wars movies are like Albert Einstein next to Transformers. I mean, Transformers is just one giant explosion, basically. But that is also super fun. It is really something that I enjoy watching. But not only did I enjoy the movies from Michael Bay, I also enjoyed the video games that came along with the movies because this was obviously a time back in the sort of mid to late 2000s where there were a bunch of movie licensed games coming out. So every big blockbuster movie basically got a video game with it. And I think, I mean, those video games were not amazing. I mean, generally, movie license games were pretty terrible, but I did enjoy those Transformers movie license games quite a bit. And I've also seen that there's kind of been a little bit of a cult following for those games online, channels popping up with a bunch of modded content for those original Transformers games on PC. I think that's really cool and kind of shows, I think, the fact that these games did have a lot of longevity to them, even if they were kind of ignored by the wider public, given the fact that we are talking about movie license games here. Especially Transformers 2 Revenge of the Fallen. I really enjoy that video game. That is one of my favorite games. I have a ton of nostalgia for it because I remember being so hyped for it when it came out. and also up to the release. This was like one of the first games I think where I actually followed the game as it was releasing. So it's really a game I have fond memories for, but also playing it now, I do actually think it has a lot of potential. Might want to do a video on that game someday, who knows. Next up, I wanted to give a few comments on physical video games. And I really think it's cool to collect physical video games. It's something you can display on your shelf. And it really is the whole collection aspect that I also find enticing. But obviously, when we're talking about PC specifically, which is obviously the platform I mainly play on, the the physical games market has been dead for a very, very long time, much longer than it's been kind of dying out for consoles. Since we got Steam and all these other digital distribution platforms, everyone basically buys their games online. So it's impossible to buy a new game physically for the PC, which is kind of sad, I feel, even though I also see the fact that, having everything on Steam is much more convenient, certainly. But I do remember the time back in the mid 2000s where it was still normal to buy PC games on a physical disc and put it into your computer and play it that way. And the two games I've put here on the screen are the two games that I actually still own physically. I own a small physical PC game collection, and the reason why I do that is because there are certain games that you actually can't get online. So I think it's worthwhile to keep those games and to be able to play them. And specifically, we're talking about first and foremost War World Tactical Combat, which is this sort of third person mech game that came out in the late 2000s, I think. And it's a really fun game, I would say. It's not anything groundbreaking, but it is fun running around shooting different weapons with your mech at other mechs. And there's also a bunch of customizability. You can choose different weapons. There are a bunch of different levels. And I actually also think there's like an offline deathmatch mode kind of thing, because obviously I don't think you're going to have any luck with the servers anymore. The other game I put here is Blur, which is this super interesting racing game that came out also around the same time. Maybe it might have been like the early 2010s. But it's an interesting game because it's kind of like Mario Kart, except it's Mario Kart with real world cars. You can fire off a bunch of different abilities, you can crash into your opponents, and it is really an arcadey game at its core, but it has that realistic aesthetic, and I really enjoy that kind of weird mix up of those two different types of games. So those are just the examples of the physical games I own now. I owned more in the past, but I like traded those in at this point. I only want to keep onto the few different video games on disc that can't be obtained any other way. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is kind of a mix of different things. It's kind of an amalgamation in my head a little bit, but I'm talking about the PlayStation brand, more specifically the PlayStation Vita, and more specifically the Wipeout games. So if we start with the broad, section, PlayStation is kind of the console platform that I have the most familiarity with. I used to own a PS3 back in the day, and that was kind of my platform of choice before I had an actual PC that could run games. But since then, I haven't really had a PlayStation of any kind. The only PlayStation platform I still own is the PlayStation Vita. Now, the reason why that is the case is that the PlayStation Vita is obviously a portable platform, which I think is a nice supplement to having a gaming PC because the gaming PC isn't really mobile, obviously. You can't take it anywhere, but you can play the PlayStation Vita on the bus or the train or in your bed or wherever else you want to play it. And additionally, I also owned a PS Vita actually when it came out back in 2013 ish, I think. And it has some nostalgia for me as a result of that. I was also really fond of the idea of the PS Vita because the whole concept was that you could take these console level games with realistic graphics and put them in this small form factor handheld gaming console. And they achieved that, I think, really successfully. They were releasing a bunch of different games, PlayStation titles that were console level quality but were being played on this handheld. And again, as I indicated, the one I'm most interested in is the Wipeout series because I always loved Wipeout. Again, it's the sci-fi theme, it's the super clean aesthetic. I love the aesthetic of Wipeout. Wipeout is such a fast game, but it's also an arcadey game. You can have different weapons, and you can use those weapons against your opponents to get ahead in the race. So that's something I really enjoy, and I don't really think there's been any game released that has matched Wipeout. I mean, there have been contenders. You look at games like Redout or Pacer. Those games are fine. I think they're fun, but they don't really capture the pure genius, in my opinion, of Wipeout. The music, the speed, everything is just perfect in Wipeout. And I'm so sad about the fact that Studio Liverpool, which is the developers of Wipeout, that they had to shut down back in 2012 when they released Wipeout 2048 for the PS Vita, which ended up being their last game, unfortunately. Those were the topics I thought about. I don't know if you think any of these topics are worth a video on its own. I think I came out with the majority of my thoughts on these topics, honestly. So I'm a bit unsure what I would want to put in an actual video deep dive. You know, if we're talking about these movies, for instance, Transformers or Star Wars, that's just a whole different caliber of video, honestly, to make. So I don't really know if that's something I would want to do. But if you have any thoughts on it, please put it down in the comment section below, as always. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the rambling and maybe you got something productive done in the meantime. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. We'll be in touch again real soon.